We've heard a lot about companies that are looking at alternative fuels. We're one of the few companies that actually do use alternative fuels. Some of our earlier engines were LNG burning, but we went through a process of converting one of our ships to actually burn ethane, which is one of the alternative fuels that so many people have talked about today. Just a little introduction there about Navigator Gas. We're a floating pipeline, as we like to describe ourselves, connecting producers and end users, shipping LPGs, petchems, and ammonia all over the world. This is just a short history of Navigator, how we've grown. We're a very young company, actually. We haven't been around for many years at all. One of the steps you see there is when we started building mid-size vessels, LNG-powered mid-size vessels, in 2016. This was shortly after the purchase of 11 handy-size vessels from Maersk Tankers, traditional build vessels, but we quickly moved on to more modern vessels using alternative fuels, specifically LNG. Why ethane? Why did we build ships that could transport ethane? Why do we think ethane is a good source of fuel for us in the future? Marcus Hook is an export location now, which is the end point of several new pipelines that are being built in the USA. Mariner East 1 is a pipeline that ends in Marcus Hook, which carries about 75,000 barrels per day of natural gas liquids to the coast for export. A new 350-mile pipeline has just about to reach conclusion, actually. Mariner East 2, Mariner East 3, I've heard of these pipelines referred to yesterday at the awards. They will eventually add another 600,000 barrels per day of natural gas liquids flowing towards the coast. A large portion of which is, of course, natural gas, but also ethane. A large percentage of what's available for export is actually ethane. Target completion for those pipelines was actually about a year and a half ago, but they've suffered a lot of setbacks in the interim period. And as we had built 4 mid-sized vessels to be ready for that export about 18 months ago, those ships have been sitting around for quite a long time looking for work in the market, which is actually not what they were built for. Export of the mid-size vessels was to go to international markets, some of which are starting to come online now. We've lifted the first cargo out of Marcus Hook very, very recently, an ethane cargo. However, permitting problems continue to beset that project and impacted quite significantly, so actually exports have stopped again. So the path to using ethane, regular supplies of ethane, and getting them to use them as a fuel is not a guaranteed option at the moment, but we should get there eventually. Navigator Gas is purely LPG. That's all we carry, LPG, petchems, ammonia as well, some of which we've talked about using ammonia as a fuel. 4 of the sister ships of Aurora are all designed for LNG burning. And these were built back in 2016, the first ship delivered. But some of the problems that we had using LNG as a fuel was simply because it wasn't available in the market. Finding LNG as a bunker fuel was extremely difficult. So there is Navigator Aurora, some of the finer details of Navigator Aurora. You can see that she has a GI engine, initially for LNG burning, but she also has 2 large auxiliary engines, which are also LNG powered as well. The main engine is MEN, the auxiliary engines are Wärtsilä. At the moment, one of the reasons we changed over was, this is a picture of Navigator Aurora loading 500 tons of LNG in the Baltic last year. She had initially operated on LNG when we were in the Far East, but as we moved from the Far East into the Middle East and towards Europe, finding LNG in bunkering quantities less than 1,000 tons, as I said previously, was extremely difficult. We eventually found an LNG-sized bunkering parcel in Sweden, of all places, and this is the ship loading 500 tons there. The main purpose of loading LNG at that point, just as we were running up to the conversion for ethane, was to actually prove that the gas system was still working. As we hadn't been able to source LNG as a fuel, the system had been dormant for almost a year by that point. So we weren't actually sure what the condition of the system was, even though it had been stored under nitrogen. Some of the reasons to convert, we hear that obviously charterers have to be on side, and that's a very significant reason. The Navigator Aurora is under a 10-year charter. So without the input of the charterers, who are actually saving the money on these fuel conversions, without their support and input financially, it wouldn't have made any commercial sense for Navigator at all. But the reasons to do the project, very compelling, meets the 2020 regulations, of course, environmental stewardship. We have a fixed source of fuel. It's there guaranteed when you're on a regular run under a charter. When we're loading ethane as cargo, we're also loading the bunker tanks at the same time. So you have a fixed source and a fixed price, and it's guaranteed. One of the outcomes for that, of course, is there's less bunkering days. We don't leave the dock and sit at anchor for 2 or 3 days waiting for somebody to come along and deliver high sulfur fuel oil. Estimated savings, roughly about $1 million a year. Very compelling reasons for the charterers to get involved. We won't be fitting scrubbers. I know that's an entirely different and contentious subject, and I'm happy to provide people with the reasons why we won't be fitting scrubbers, and I know some of you are big supporters of scrubbers in the audience. But it's not for the reasons that you might think. It's not because of strong objections to scrubbers as a means to meet compliance. It's very much in terms of what do our competition do, where are our challenges from, what kind of ships do we have now. Majority of our ships are quite new, they're very low fuel consuming ships anyway. So one of the reasons we'll not be fitting scrubbers is that, but there are many others. The outcome of the conversion on sulfur emissions was well known beforehand, of course. You can see here that the reduction in NOx, SOx and CO2 emissions is fairly impressive, but obviously the target was to reduce SOx down to levels where it will be compliant with the 2020 regulations. You do see there a small drop in CO2 emissions as well as a sideline, but not nearly as much as we would like, and certainly not enough to meet 2030 or 2050 regulations. It was quite a complex route to get ethane authorized as an alternative fuel to LNG. The first hazard that was done with ABS back in 2014 was actually for a different kind of ship completely. This had to be revised significantly in 2017 to ensure that compliance with class flag and statutory requirements was still relevant. And more importantly, to check against the updated IGC code, MARPOL Annex 9, Regulation 13. The hazard review in 2017 identified that there were no new risks, that the original 21 medium risk findings, which had all been mitigated, still were there, except for 2 concerning gas detection and ventilation. The updated roadmap for the project covers the process of identifying all of the steps that had to be risk assessed and mitigated before the conversion could be approved. You'll notice that the US Coast Guard were also notified at the end box there to make sure that we didn't fall foul of any misinterpretations of the IGC code or classification or any state requirements while using ethane and not LNG as a fuel in US waters. The plan for certification of the new ethane mode involved using 2-cylinder test engine in Kawasaki in Japan, identically set up to the engine on Navigator Aurora. As you can see in the picture there, the main issues that we identified early on, that the lower injection pressure on the engine was leading to soot formation, which of course wasn't ideal. Increasing the injection pressure from 300 to 400 bar was the answer, but it would have been extremely complex and very expensive to convert the whole fuel gas system on Navigator Aurora to be able to inject fuel at 400 bar. The far more cost-effective solution was using the 300 bar existing system, of course, and not modifying the fuel gas system extensively, and modifying the engine components, timing, and fuel gas control system to reduce the soot emissions to acceptable levels, which you can see on this graph, especially at higher loads where the ship operates. One of the most noticeable outcomes of the project was, of course, that we didn't have to rewrite the NOx technical file, which would have been a major hurdle if we'd had to rewrite that to go through this project. It wasn't considered to be a major conversion or substantial modification of the engine for the purposes of the next technical file, and that was confirmed by ABS. This is the list of components that had to be changed and the reasons why. You'll notice, looking at some of the modifications, that some are for technical reasons, but most significant, such as changing the cylinder heads, was done to address safety concerns that had been identified during the hazard. This is the project timeline. It ran for 15 days and was completed roughly on schedule. Sea trials lasted for longer than expected because there were significant numbers of difficulty getting the engine to run on gas burning full time. There's some of the issues that we still contend with today. Make no mistake, these are very, very complex projects. The main part of the project was a complete strip down of the engine, change all the cylinder heads, gas valves, cylinder liners, and replace all of the chain pipes. Temperature variation when you use an ethane, if it escapes under pressure, is that it has a significantly lower pressure drop than LNG, which is counterintuitive when you think of the temperature of LNG itself as a fuel. The only outstanding items from the hazard were ventilation and gas detection system. Ethane is heavier than LNG. So we had to conduct live smoke tests in the engine room to test dispersion patterns and identify where ventilation and gas detector modifications had to be made. This project was big news. It was an industry first. The news wires and the press were buzzing with news, especially our website, of course, as it was the first ever conversion of an LNGI engine to an ethane-burning GIE engine. Today, Aurora is still running regularly on ethane fuel and are now working on converting the auxiliary engines from LNG to ethane fuel as well. And we're now working with Wärtsilä to supply them with ethane to be able to conduct those tests. Needless to say, I was very proud to receive this award last night on behalf of Navigator. Gaining industry recognition for progressive work that the Navigator Gas is undertaking to meet our collective environmental protection obligations is always very welcome. Our ambitions don't end there. We're now involved in a project to develop ammonia as a fuel, some of which we've already heard already, and I hope to tell you more about in the future when I'm accepting that award, maybe next year. Thank you very much.